I think we'll get underway here today. I've told all the panelists just to turn off their cell phones. I guess you guys can have it on in, manner mode or something like that. Anyway, good afternoon. I'm Reed Kramer of the New America Foundation, and I direct our asset building program here, which focuses on a broad array of social policy issues. And one of our primary concerns is poverty alleviation and the search for innovative and effective proposals that can break the cycle of poverty, which really has been an issue of long-standing concern in America to many. And as the new poverty numbers that are going to come out later this week will attest, it's a very difficult nut to crack, especially in the context of a current economic recession. I think that the poverty debate and discussion really needs to look at these issues in a new light. So this is why I'm very pleased to welcome you here today to the New America Foundation for our event on updating poverty, which is going to highlight a special report in the September edition of the American Prospect magazine. The report is called A New Agenda for Hard Times, and it's in your packets. And we have here Marc Schmidt and Shelley Waters Boots, who edited the special report and contributed to it, along with authors Dana Goldstein and Derek Hamilton. So we look forward to hearing from them. I'll also up front extend a special welcome to our online viewers. We broadcast all of our events live and on demand for future viewing. So I invite you to tell your friends if they missed our discussion today. They can always come back and follow the conversation along. And can also visit our website, newamerica.net, to learn more about what we're doing, our work, program updates, and announcements for future events. At the outset here, I'll just say another word about our program, the asset building program. And really the goal of our work is to ensure that assets, as broadly conceived in their many different forms, become part of how social policy is conceived, developed, and delivered. And we focus our efforts this way on kind of generating ideas that can expand savings and ownership, especially to those with lower incomes and with fewer resources. And the reason we do this is because we think there's great promise in connecting economic opportunity to economic security, especially as it plays out over the long term and across the life course. And in fact, if we succeed in broadening asset ownership, we might have a number of kind of beneficial effects from this approach. One might be just giving everybody in the society a greater stake in the commonwealth. And this is a feature of, I think, an important feature of what a functioning democracy should look like. And I think we're still a long way from achieving that. Certainly here in Washington, it appears that way often. Poverty as a policy topic generally has been approached as an income problem, and looking at income at a moment in time certainly is a valuable perspective. It is a great challenge for families to survive with low or no incomes, but it's especially debilitating if this is a situation that extends over time, and that can be very debilitating. So giving people access to savings and resources that they can invest strategically over the life course we think is particularly valuable. And a number of innovative proposals have been developed in recent years that do just that, several of which are highlighted in the special report, and I think we're going to touch on today. I also will note that over the weekend, President Obama used his Labor Day address to highlight the important role that savings plays in economic security, especially in the retirement years. But also, he emphasized in his remarks that its role in promoting kind of the economic recovery The goal is not to go back to the conditions that we had previously, but to kind of create a stronger economic foundation and a new economy. And the Obama White House is really seeing savings as playing a significant role in this. And they have proposals in their budget that we've outlined in some work called the Assets Report for you to review. But over the weekend, they outlined a few additional low-cost administrative proposals that they're going to pursue right away that really make this connection and promote savings in the near term, especially by lower-income families. So some of this work we've been involved in promoting and developing, and we certainly applaud those constructive efforts by the administration, and I think we want to see more. I want to acknowledge at this point our funders of this work who play a really important role in both their commitment to poverty issues and also supporting the kind of work that we do. And not surprisingly, 3 of them also have supported this special report, and they're the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation, the Annie E. Casey Foundation, and the Ford Foundation. So on this day, after Labor Day, it really is time to get to work. The numbers that are going to come out this week are going to show that poverty is on the rise, and I think it will generate some, a few news clippings, some interest, but really the numbers are going to be very limited in kind of exposing a greater perspective on the extent of poverty in America today for a number of reasons. They have a lot of kind of limitations. They're not going to tell the whole story, and the data is really less helpful than it should be in revealing the extent of economic insecurity. Families facing job loss, rising debt, depleted savings are all going to see their economic insecurity rising. However, it is a good time to take stock and to look at the landscape and some of the ideas that have been brewing in the field at the local level, pursued by local governments, community groups, at some D.C. think tanks, and in really upstart progressive political magazines such as the American Prospect. So I'm very pleased. I'm a big fan of the American Prospect. I'm a big fan of Marc Schmidt, the editor, who's a colleague here at the New America Foundation as a senior fellow and has wonderful writing on this stuff and is someone that combines expertise in both politics and policy, which is actually a pretty rare combination, but one which is really valuable to the debate. So let me turn it over to Marc. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'm a big Reed Kramer fan and enjoy, glad to be back behind this podium. I think for those of you who've seen me at this podium and at our old office on various other topics, you probably know that I'm not, a singular expert on poverty. It's an issue that at various times I've spent a lot of time on, and it was kind of exciting when some of the funders that Reed mentioned approached me about potentially doing one of these special reports on the issue to really dig in and revisit the issue. And I was really glad to be able to have the help of Shelley Waters Boots, who was a colleague of mine here at New America, and really is does spend almost all of her time on this issue, and to look back at it again. And as I look out at the room, I see a lot of it's a little intimidating because I see a lot of people who I know who really are this city's and this country's really leading experts on the issue. But it's fun sometimes, I think, when you it's like sometimes you don't quite see how your own children grow as much as you see, like if you have a niece or a child of a friend who you see every year or so, you sort of see the change sometimes more than you see in your own children. And it's sometimes what I noticed in digging deep into this issue was, and what I tried to bring out what Shelley and I tried to bring out in the opening piece is the degree to which there are some significant changes in the way we're able to think about policy and some of the tools that we're able to bring to bear on the issue. And I think some of the work that's gone on at think tanks has a lot to do with that. I think on the one hand, it's easy to say, as I think the Center for American Progress Initiative did a couple years ago, the Spotlight on Poverty, and some of the and as is discussed in the last article in this in this report by Alec McGillis of the Washington Post, it's easy to say that we haven't quite gotten the political momentum behind a real effort to talk about poverty and to confront poverty in this country, despite an economic crisis that makes it a realistic possibility for a much larger proportion of Americans. At the same time, as I look at it, I think we've really broadened the landscape of ways to talk about it and tools that we can begin to bring to bear on the issue, so that both subtly, I mean, lots of things in this country happen without a big political debate. I mean, it's interesting to note that as much as, we're in a huge political fight about healthcare reform, very, very high profile. At the same time, and that hopefully that will succeed, and that's really at the root of all these things. At the same time, huge steps in progress are often made very quietly, very subtly, by a change in the consensus among really a kind of elites in the institutions, and things like the vast expansion of Medicaid in the 80s and 90s and things like that. And I think a lot of things have happened since. I mean, I was deeply shaped and to some extent wounded and politicized in different ways by the welfare wars of the mid 1990s, when I was working for a member of the Senate Finance Committee and fighting that every step of the way. But I think since that time, we've seen both changes in policy and changes in possibility that I think change the menu of ideas. And a couple of those that I've talked about are, first, I think the beginning of the expansion of thinking about assets and savings and something other than income as an essential component of helping people escape poverty and build sufficient lives for themselves. And I think that both real world work and thinking have fed into a tremendous expansion of that. I think we've seen a real transformation in really subtle ways, so that we now have the creation, partly as a result of welfare reform, partly of other things, of something that looks more like, you wouldn't really call it a safety net. It's kind of like a safety net for good times, a safety net that's almost more effective in good economic times than it is in bad economic times, which of course is not what you expect from a safety net, but at certain times it is helpful for people between the expansions of the EITC, the transformation of Medicaid, the ability of states to direct more of their resources towards helping people gain employment. You've seen the real emergence of a kind of support system for working families that really wasn't there 20, 25 years ago, and that changes your calculation of possibilities if you can really flesh that out. I think the changes in child support, which was an issue that I worked on a lot, and it's very gratifying to see, real world, hundreds of little changes that have real world impact on people's ability to be economically self-sufficient. And then some of the experiments, which my colleague Dana Goldstein will talk about, with behavioral incentives. And I think there's a broader acceptance that of course there are lots of choices that poverty isn't simply a matter of too little money. There are choices that people make that can help them make the most of. If society is able to create those opportunities for them, they can help people make the most of those opportunities. And whether there's a possibility that some of what we know about behavior, or, for example, simply making savings incentives, something Reed and Ray Bashar have talked about a lot, simply making savings incentives a default rather than a choice. Little tweaks like that can really affect the environment of people being able to take full advantage of the kind of public policies we want to create. So I think of it as I think the message we tried to create with this report is that there's a set of ideas out there that allow us, when we're ready to go after this issue in a new and way that kind of hits it at all angles, and really are able to confront poverty in a significant way. And maybe we can get to the point where if we set a tangible goal as they did in the UK, and we have an article about that as well. If you set a tangible goal, as the Center for American Progress recommended a couple of years ago, we actually have all the tools to bring to bear to actually achieve that goal, and that's I think what we should aspire to, and what I hope my colleagues will talk about. So I'm going to turn it over to Shelley, who was a joy to work with on this project and kind of reunite with, and she'll say a few words. We'll have Derek Hamilton and Dana Goldstein. We'll talk about some of the issues they raised in their articles, and then I'll moderate a Q&A session. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. It's just a delight to be here, and it was such an interesting project to work on, given a lot of the other confluences in the work that I'm doing right now in my life. So this is, Mark doesn't know this, but I pretty much I would do anything that he asked me to do, because he's just such a great colleague to work with. But I wanted to talk a bit, because the paper that my colleague Karen Martinson, who's here today, and I wrote was a bit of a fast brush through a lot of the safety net programs, and I wanted to talk a little bit about that on the eve of what we expect to be, as Reed said, a pretty significant and sizable increase in the poverty rate that we'll see coming out later in this week. And it's a little bit hard to be hopeful in that sense. But I'll steal a line from my former boss here at New America, who just gave a speech on her confirmation and said that sometimes cynicism in D.C. is mistaken for intellectualism. So I'm going to be purposefully unintellectual and be optimistic, I think, about what we can accomplish on these issues. I think the failed economic policies of the last 8 years, along with, I agree with Mark, some overzealous work-first policies that really began under the Clinton administration, leave us with quite a lot to be done. But there is opportunity in every crisis, and I think if we start looking at some of the media stories that start highlighting how some of our social safety net service programs are really being stretched right now in this downturn, or even the personalized accounts of some of the lost jobs, the lost homes, the lost hope for a lot of families, I think that we collectively can start thinking about how to both reframe and refocus some of our programs and supports that we collectively want to build within our society to protect us from what Roosevelt called the hazards and vicissitudes of life. As Alex's paper points out in this report, and I strongly encourage you to read all of it and really read them as a package, because Mark and I think, meant them to be read that way. We really I do see an administration that is willing to kind of take on some of these larger issues, the economic security and opportunity. By tackling education and healthcare, I think there's really an opportunity to think about some of the more negative and somewhat pejorative cobwebs that we've all been carrying around as progressives around some of these social safety net systems, and really think about a way of recrafting them and, to better meet the needs of our fellow citizens. So in this vein, Karen and I really took a look at a couple of key supports that are out there. The food stamp or SNAP program, as we're told to call it now, unemployment insurance, TANF, and for good measure, I threw in a little bit on Social Security, an idea on Social Security, though we didn't tackle Social Security reform by any means. And I want to say that what came out of that now, having reflected on the article, is a couple of core principles that I think we could start thinking about. Core principles about what a safety net should really do in a 21st century, and to really think about what lessons this downturn in the economy has really taught us about what's working and what's not working. I think the first core principle that we came away with, is when the economy sours, and it does sour, we have a shared responsibility to ensure that our fellow citizens don't hit rock bottom. So what do we have to put in place that's not necessarily tied to work, because we know that the economic cycles happen. There are booms, there are busts. What do we have to put in place to ensure that that happens? And then secondly, as these times in unemployment actually seem more and more frequent, especially in our new, with our markets and industries and our new economy shifting so quickly, a global economy, how do we ensure that workers have the time and resources to retool, to reskill, and to reemploy? And I think we haven't given that as much thought, but now's the time. And then finally, in this economy that's not only squeezed, families feeling squeezed by money, but also by time, I think that we have to allow that in our lives there will be times when full-time, full-year work is just not possible. That there are times just in the fact of being human, whether it's a new baby or a sick child or an ailing parent, that there are some times where short spells where we are going to be away from work. And how do we collectively look at ways as a nation to ensure that these are available more universally and that they don't spiral people into some of the downward economic trends that we see. So given that, I'll talk briefly about a few of these programs. I think food stamps in general is one I'll skip over a bit just because I think compared to the other ones we look at is probably doing some of the best work. There's certainly more to be done, more on outreach. A colleague of mine at the Urban Institute actually has an interesting proposal about adding checkboxes to tax forms that allow people to actually start the application process, and I think that's a very innovative idea in ways in which we can help tie systems together and make it easier for people to get the supports that they need. But in general, I think that one is actually showing signs of being responsive to a downturn economy by getting folks on the rolls and helping make sure that people have some of the food security that they need. The others, however, we had quite a list of recommendations for, and I'll start with unemployment insurance, the one I probably know the least about. But I do think that when you have a system that's only serving about a third of all of those unemployed and an even smaller proportion of low-wage workers, it really begs for a really long and serious conversation about what we can do about unemployment insurance, and that really go even beyond, I think, where the administration has started with some of their positive steps. But there's certainly this is not a system that's aligned with some of these core principles that we outlined. So I would start in expanding federal requirements by making sure that we're covering part-time and temporary workers and being really responsive to the kind of workforce that we have now, a greater benefit for low-wage workers. And I really think we should look seriously at this experience rating. So as those of you who know, unemployment insurance, you're taxed as an employer more if you lay off more frequently. But most of the signs are showing that that's not really working as it was intended. Employers are basically trying to fight every uninsurance claim left and right to avoid the tax. So I think we could think about a fairer tax system that's broader, that covers more workers. TANF reauthorization, if we get to TANF reauthorization, I think is another opportunity for us to think about what this means in a downturn economy and how do we help people build skills when there aren't jobs in times of high unemployment like now. So thinking about education and training opportunities, having that count as work requirements, better aligning it with WIA, which is also going to be up for reauthorization, and really thinking about how we tie these systems together in a way that really allows us to help build pipelines for low-wage workers to come in, to get the training and skills they need, have it connected to industries that have jobs available. So I think we have some real opportunities to think about how these systems come together, and remembering that in downturned economies with high unemployment rates, it's really hard to kind of follow through on this work first philosophy. And then finally, and this is an issue that I've been working on most recently, I think thinking about a national family insurance system, family security insurance system that basically builds in what 5 states and Puerto Rico has as a temporary disability insurance, but really thinking about these short spells of time off that we'll need as workers as we're thinking about the life cycle. I think Reed mentioned this issue of life course. European researchers are actually way ahead of us on thinking about sort of life course policies and thinking about how through different cycles in a worker's life there are different needs, and we're going to need times off at different points in that life cycle. So this idea is basically to add a nominal payroll increase to the Social Security system that then would provide for this temporary time off that would really allow us to do what we have to do as human beings. So time to care, time to heal when we're sick, time to heal others, and time to educate ourselves, which is really an important piece of what we need to provide to ensure that people can become self-sufficient. So I'll just conclude by acknowledging, as I do in the paper, that I know the Obama administration probably isn't looking for a lot of other really big issues to tackle right now. But I think he should take a cue a bit from Franklin Roosevelt, who was in a very similar situation in a national crisis. And he said something that really struck home to me, and I'll share it with you, which is that it's childish to speak of recovery first and then reconstruction afterwards. It's the very nature of the processes of recovery that we must avoid the destructive influences of the past. So to get this recovery right, we really have to think about not just building back to where we were, but building something better that works for the families that need the support. I'll stop there.
I have to remember to never go after Shelley whenever I have to give any type of talk. She raises the bar. Well, first I'd like to thank the New America Foundation for their invitation to speak today, the American Prospect Magazine for providing a platform for me to discuss our ideas. Also, Insight, the Center for Community Economic Development, and the Closing the Racial Wealth Gap Initiative for promoting my work, along with others, through their network, Expert of Color Network. And finally, my co-author, who's not here today, William Sandy Darity. Okay. So despite enormous and persistent racial disparities, particularly with respect to wealth, the ascendant American narrative is one that proclaims that our society has transcended the racial divide. This proclamation often is coupled with the claim that remaining disparities are due primarily to dysfunctional behaviors on the part of blacks. In such a climate, it appears the only acceptable remedial social policies are those that are facially race neutral. However, even without the capacity to redistribute assets directly on the basis of race, our nation still can do so indirectly by judiciously using wealth as the standard for redistributive resources. Wealth is the paramount indicator of social well-being. It's also a dramatic indicator of black-white inequality. The 2002 Survey of Income and Program Participation indicates a close to $90,000 median household wealth for white families in comparison to a meager $8,000 and $6,000 net worth for Latino and black households, respectively. This disparity is so pronounced that the median Latino and black household would have to save 100% of their income for 3 consecutive years to close the gap. Moreover, the racial wealth gap spans demographics of age, education, marital status, and income. Black households typically have less than a quarter of the wealth of otherwise comparable white households. Indeed, the bottom income quartile, the group which contains the working poor, is characterized by the typical black family having a mere 2% of the wealth of the typical white family in that same quartile. Okay. Perhaps even more disturbing, the median wealth of black families whose head graduated from college is less than the median wealth of white families whose head dropped out of high school. Okay. So the post-racial ideology represents a shift from some acknowledgement of social responsibility for the conditions of black America to a position where blacks need to, quote, get over it and, quote, take personal responsibility. Its rhetoric argues that discrimination and other social barriers are largely things of the past, that blacks now need to stop playing the victim role and recognize their own faults in the persistence of racial inequality. Moreover, blacks are enjoined to stop making particularistic claims on America and solely pursue programs of social change designed to reach all Americans. All of these sentiments were expressed plainly by Barack Obama in his More Perfect Union speech during the campaign in Philadelphia. The example of the ascendancy of blacks to elite positions is a typical evidence put forth to support the post-racial narrative. Common examples before Obama included the hiring of black CEOs at Fortune 500 corporations and the appointment of blacks at the highest level of the cabinet, such as Secretary of State and National Security Advisor. Post-racialists attempt to bolster their case by arguing that these examples of black exceptionalism result from individual or familial acts of perseverance and hard work. Consistent with these norms are the two conventional explanations put forth to explain the racial wealth gap. The first is the notion that in search of immediate gratification, blacks are less frugal when it comes to savings. Indeed, at a recent lecture this past spring at Morehouse College, when asked why the racial wealth gap was so large, Federal Reserve Chair Ben Bernanke attributed the gap to a lack of financial literacy on the part of blacks, particularly with respect to savings. But it has not historically been the case, nor is it now the case, that blacks are more profligate than whites. Economists ranging from Milton Friedman to the recently deceased founder of the Caucus of Black Economists, Marcus Alexis, found that after accounting for household income, blacks have a slightly higher savings rate than whites. More recently, Maury Gittleman and Ed Wolf also found that blacks have a slight savings rate edge over whites, again after adjusting for household income. Furthermore, the mild black savings rate advantage at most income levels is actually indicative of even greater black frugality because blacks who attain higher incomes typically have a greater array of kin and family obligations to assisting low-income relatives compared to whites. The second explanation that supports the post-racial narrative is one that claims inferior black asset management, which results in lower portfolio returns. However, in that Gittleman and Wolf study, based on data before the subprime and mortgage market crises, they find no significant racial differences in asset appreciation rates for families with positive assets once you control for income. This is illustrative of additional evidence of a post-racial mythology. More important, careful economic studies actually demonstrate that inheritance, bequests, and intra-family transfers account for more of the racial wealth gap than any other demographic and socioeconomic indicators, including education, income, and household structure. These intra-familial transfers, the primary source of wealth for most Americans with positive net worth, are transfers of blatant non-merit resources. Right? So why do blacks have vastly less resources to transfer to the next generation? Apart from the national failure to endow black ex-slaves with the promised 40 acres and a mule, blacks were deprived systematically of property accumulated between 1880 and 1910 by government complicity, fraud, and seizure by white terrorists. During the first 3 decades of the 20th century, prosperous black communities and their associated property literally were destroyed by white rioters in communities ranging from Wilmington, North Carolina to Tulsa, Oklahoma. The historical use of restrictive covenants, redlining, and general housing and lending discrimination are also factors that inhibit blacks from accumulating wealth at the same rate that white families have. So to be clear, black households have transferred less wealth to the next generation because black households consistently have been denied the opportunity to accumulate wealth from generation to generation. So given the importance of intergenerational transfers of wealth and past and present barriers preventing black wealth accumulation, private actions and market forces alone cannot close the unjust racial wealth gap. Public sector intervention is necessary. So does the public sector have the resources to tackle the racial wealth gap? The answer must be a resounding yes. The federal government's ability to raise $70 billion for TARP, along with an additional $2.5 trillion to aid the ailing financial system by April of this year, is indicative of the government's ability to raise and leverage substantial sums of funds quickly. We are less optimistic about the public will to address the racial wealth gap. Indeed, the surge in the post-racial perspective has moved the public sentiment strongly away from race-specific social policies. But all is not lost. Since the distribution of white and black wealth are so disparate, for example, 85% of black families have wealth holdings below the median white family, wealth can be an effective non-race-based instrument to eliminate racial inequality. A shift from income-based means tests to wealth-based means tests for transfer programs, policies with eligibility based on net worth at some level below the national median would reach a large proportion of black households and can go a long way towards closing the racial wealth gap, especially if they include some asset-building dimension. Over the past 20 years, demonstration programs designed to develop asset capacity of the poor have emerged. One of the most notable is the Savings for Education, Entrepreneurship, and Down Payment, the SEED initiative, which establishes children's development account. Okay. These also have been referred to as baby bonds, and they were designed to create endowed trusts for children at birth. The United Kingdom has moved beyond the demonstration stage. Beginning in 2005, every newborn in the UK receives a trust ranging from £250 to £500, depending on familial resources. Every year, and then in the U.S., every year since 2004, the American Savings for Personal Investment, Retirement, and Education, the ASPIRE Act, is introduced in Congress to establish universal child development accounts. We envision a baby bond plan of much greater scale and magnitude, progressively rising to $50,000 or $60,000 for children and families in the lowest wealth quartile, and accessible only when that child turns 18 years of age. We also would determine eligibility for such a program based on the net worth position of the child's family rather than income. Since the nation's black president eschews race-specific policies, perhaps a strongly amended ASPIRE bill designed to progressively distribute funds based on familial net worth can be the policy that enables him to, quote, bind our grievances to the larger aspirations of Americans, end quote. So rather than a race-neutral America, the ideal should be a race-fair America. For this to occur, the transmission of racial economic advantage or disadvantage across generations would have to cease. Public provisions of a substantial trust fund for newborn from families that are wealth poor will go a long way towards achieving that ideal.
Hi. So I'm actually really glad that I'm going after Derek, not because he didn't do a great job, that was great, but I think the program I'm about to talk about sort of combines a more traditional focus on income with a forward-looking focus on how to develop assets and develop the capacity to save and build wealth. So what my piece is about in this issue is Opportunity New York City, which is a conditional cash transfer program run by the Bloomberg administration, or a CCT. So I'm going to use that term, CCT. It's based on Oportunidades, which is a work and education benefits program for women who typically are subsistence farmers in rural Mexico. And I think that was launched in the 80s or 90s. And it was quite successful. It was sort of focused on rewarding women who got their kids to school, who were doing a better job of providing opportunities for their children. And the goal there was to sort of take these kids from a future of subsistence farming or picking berries or fruits out in the fields to where they could work, say, in the tourism industry or work behind a cash register, kind of put them into the service sector and bring them into the working middle class. And it was quite successful in Mexico. It had sort of a feminist component toward it because it was really empowering mothers. But typically, those mothers did have a male partner in the household with them. And there's a lot of interesting research on how kind of giving the money to the woman, giving her that sort of power within the family changed dynamics. I mean, some of it was negative. There were some instances of increased rates of spousal abuse, for example, as the woman was sort of exercising an economic power that she had never had in the family before. But on the whole, this was a positive experiment. It's sort of kind of similar to micropayments, which you're probably familiar with. And so that kind of trickled up to North America. And in Canada and Minnesota, there were conditional cash transfer CCT programs. Mostly they focused on getting families that were on welfare, getting the parents in those families to have jobs, and they would reward them with some sort of additional payments that wouldn't make them ineligible for any of the social services that they were already receiving. But the New York City experiment, Opportunity NYC, is quite different. I'm going to talk about some of the ways where it's really sort of the first really to scale large CCT program in the United States. It's part of Mayor Bloomberg's Center for Economic Opportunity, which has a number of interesting and innovative anti-poverty efforts, which I'd encourage you to learn more about. But this particular program, it costs $25 million annually, And it's an experiment. So there's 2,400 families in a control group, and there's 2,400 families who are actually getting benefits. And it's funded entirely by philanthropies. So there's no government money going toward this, which also distinguishes it from past efforts. And right now we're in the second year of a 3-year trial for this opportunity program. And basically what it does, it offers poor mothers, they're basically entirely Black and Latina poor single moms, cash rewards. For example, you can get $200 for going to the doctor yourself, $200 for each of your children going to the doctor. You can get $50 every 2 months if your child has good school attendance. If your high school student passes a Regents examination, for each Regents examination that they pass in every subject, they can get $600, which is quite a lot. And then if you're a single mom and you manage to take a skills-building course while working part-time, and you have to be doing both of those things at once, you can actually get $3,000 for that. So you can get quite a lot from this, and in fact, the typical family that participates in Opportunity NYC earned $3,000 total in the first year. So it was a significant income, especially because to be eligible for the program, you had to make below $22,000 for a family of 3. That's 130% of the poverty level. So $3,000 can be quite significant. So I just want to talk a little bit about sort of the difficulties this program has encountered and some of its successes. The health rewards have been really successful. Basically, every family that participates in this program was already eligible for either Medicaid or some other New York State insurance program, and New York is one of the more generous states. But this program seems to have been successful at getting people to get their kids to the doctor and to the dentist more frequently than they otherwise would for these $200 payments, $100 payments. It depends on whether it's a follow-up appointment or an annual checkup. And the mothers were really great at taking advantage of that. Another thing that was a big success was school attendance for young children. So, for example, I was speaking to a woman who's one of the administrators of the program, so she's one of the people who goes out in neighborhoods and talks to the people who are participating. And one of her favorite stories, her name's Candace Perkins, and if you read my piece, I do a little profile of her, but one of her favorite stories is that there was a mom whose 2 elementary school kids were chronically truant, and the truant officer was always coming after them. And after this program started, and she knew she was going to get $50 if her kids were regularly in school when they were supposed to be, she actually started accompanying them to school every single morning to make sure that they got there and went inside the building and were in classes. And then another big success that I want to highlight, since we're talking about assets and wealth, is bank accounts. So as I said, the typical family earned $3,000 from this program, and they had 2 options for how they accessed this money. The first was a debit card, and the second was with a bank account. And many of these families, when they started the program, they did not have a bank account. So you'd expect that maybe the debit card option would be really popular. But actually, 93% of the families that participate in Opportunity NYC do now have a bank account. So that's a big success, because just the act of having that bank account can lead to savings over time. So all of that is kind of in the pro column for Opportunity NYC. What has been difficult? The work rewards program has been very difficult for people to succeed in. So I mentioned that if you're a single mom and you take a skills building course while maintaining a part-time job, you can get $3,000, and you'd think that would be a pretty big incentive. But only 3% of the single moms that participate in Opportunity NYC were able to cash in on that. And that sort of leads to some of the critiques of this program, which is that it ignores some systemic issues that are not behavioral in terms of why people are poor. For example, they have a lack of childcare. So if you're a mom, how are you going to maintain a part-time job and take a community college class if you don't have anywhere to park your kids that you feel confident is a safe space for your children during that time? So that's perhaps one explanation why that particular reward did not work out so well in the program. And then there's also issues like poor schools, lack of jobs, lack of affordable housing. You know, these people, the 1/3 of New Yorkers that are in poverty, they're in neighborhoods where there's not a lot of options. So giving them this $3,000 infusion of cash may not open up that many doors. They can't, or they're not willing to sort of leave the neighborhoods that they're already in. So just to give you a sense of what the critique of this program is based on, I talked to Mark Winston Griffith. At the time, he was the acting director of the Drum Major Institute, which is a think tank in New York. I believe now he's actually running for city council. But he said to me, quote, "Opportunity NYC reflects an understanding of poverty as a cultural problem. The missing piece is a candid conversation about the role of wages or affordable housing." So I think there's a sense, and I mean, partly this is because it's Mayor Bloomberg's project, and he's a multi-gazillionaire, and he's spending $100 million to get himself reelected without competition that's that serious. There's a sense that he backs away from a more systemic look at poverty through this more behavioral approach. And I guess, the response to that is that the $3,000 that these families have gotten for the year are really meaningful for the people who have gotten them. So let's take a look at how the $3,000 has been spent. First of all, it's important to realize that the program is absolutely non-prescriptive. There's no direction or even advice given to the families on how they should spend the money that they're earning. But they have sort of done some follow-ups and asked people, what are you spending this money on? So a couple of examples that I thought were really interesting were one mom bought a freezer. Sorry, I have a little cold. But she brought this freezer so that she could buy her groceries in bulk and save money on her shopping trips. Other things that the program's administrators have heard about is that one girl was so successful with her Regents examinations, she passed all of her Regents and she got $600 for each one of them. And then she bought herself a car so she could drive herself from her transit inaccessible Brooklyn neighborhood to community college classes. But then I also heard that some families spent the money on things that were a little bit more questionable, like iPods, video games, and things like that. And there's nothing really unusual about that. Obviously, in a big American city, there's a lot of consumer temptations, but even when you look at research that's been done on CCT and micropayment programs in the developing world, even when this money goes to people who are having trouble even finding enough calories to live, the studies suggest that when there's an influx of money through these programs, families don't necessarily spend it on food, or they don't necessarily spend it on housing. So you can give this money, but you can give money for good behavior, but you can't necessarily influence good behavior in the spending of the money. And I think that's something that is brought up, and it's a difficult issue. So the question is, should CCT programs like the one in New York be brought to scale? I posed that question to Veronica White, who's the head of Mayor Bloomberg's Center for Economic Opportunity, and she herself was actually pretty skeptical. Of all the anti-poverty programs that Mayor Bloomberg is trying, there are certainly others that are more sort of straightforward. You help people who are enrolled in community college get a part-time job, and you help them schedule that so that it works out. And, things like that seem potentially more promising. It's also a very expensive program, and it would probably need to be studied, in other cities and see how it works, and maybe in areas that aren't urban within the United States. But I do think that there's enough curiosity about CCTs that we'll continue to hear more about them going forward. The Organization of American States is meeting this fall in New York, and Hillary Clinton is the host of that. And they're going to be talking about poverty alleviation, and CCTs are going to be a focus of that meeting. That's what I'm hearing from people in New York. And so there's evidence that the White House is watching this closely, and the Obama administration is interested in CCTs. And Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton are fans of Mayor Bloomberg and are interested in this sort of more experimental approach. I'll leave it pretty much there. I guess what I'd say in closing is that the debates over whether CCTs are promising or whether we should really be taking the money that we spend on them and, say, building more affordable housing or doing something that's more straightforward. It's kind of a debate about whether what we need as progressives is new ideas or whether the good ideas are already out there, we just haven't scaled them up. And it's a frequent debate that we hear all the time among people who disagree about to what extent free market solutions are necessary and to what extent we just need more affordable government housing or something that seems simpler. So I think the writing and reporting this piece didn't give me necessarily one feeling over the other about whether this works. I definitely think it's a really interesting program. It's been it's been something important for the families that participate in it. And I think a big question is, if you've been getting $3,000 a year for 3 years through this trial, what's going to happen to your family when the trial is likely ended at the end of the year, because that's going to be a big change in your income. So I look forward to following up with this story and addressing any questions you have about Mayor Bloomberg.
All right, I'll get some of the kind of commentary and discussion going with a few brief remarks, and then Mark will facilitate a little, Q&A. A couple general comments, a couple comments specifically on Dana and Derek's pieces to kind of focus on, updating our collective understanding of poverty in 2009. And the first comment is really about something for the research community, which is we really have developed an increased, I think, understanding in the last 20 years of some of the poverty dynamics. But remarkably, the data is not really helping us to fill in some of the picture in a more complete way. The poverty statistic we use is antiquated. It's not adequate. I wrote a paper that I included in your packets back in 2003, kind of critiquing the approach, offering an alternative. The critique largely stands because nothing has really changed, even though there has been an engaged research community that has identified what some of these kind of improvements and refinements could be. And so, that it's a kind of a long-standing critique. The poverty number tracks the business cycle. That's kind of why we know numbers are going up. But we also, in advance of them coming on Thursday, but there's a lot of things that we don't know that we need to know. And so there really could be a time for improving them. And then this really is a political decision, since so much of it is ready to go. However, when there are ways of improving the official measure down the road that could be included in this change. And I think, as we've heard about, the important role that assets and savings plays in net worth and in many families' lives is important enough that it should be included in some kind of official definition of poverty. As I noted, any no or low income at a moment in time is a challenge, but it's debilitating when the durations go for a longer period. And so we need to include assets in some official definition of poverty. And this can really be linked to another point, which hinges on being able to connect concern for social insurance with ones that create long-term pathways out of poverty. And that promote economic security and social development over the life course. And I think that really is more than just a matter of emphasis. We need to figure out how these things can work together very constructively. So I think that it's worth supporting and focusing on savings and assets because they can be deployed productively, strategically at a moment in time. They can help families weather unexpected events when incomes fluctuate. But they go hand in hand with things that can help families deal with immediate hardships when they emerge on some of the points that Shelley was making. So when the entire economy experiences a downturn, we need to have policies that can respond in addition to looking at individual cases. And we know that none of us are served collectively. The society is not conserved. When children are going hungry, when families are having instability in their housing and in their neighborhoods, and also when they can't cover basic necessities. So whether we call it the safety net or something else, certainly these systems that we've used are really under stress right now. And I think this is particularly troubling at this point in time, especially because in the last 20 years, the division of responsibility has relied so much on state and local governments to deliver services at the local level. And the federal government really, at this point, needs to consider another tranche of resources that can be provided to these levels of government to just keep basic services from being cut, that are under pressure right now. So I'm actually thinking this could be part of another stimulus package that we should consider. And when if these extra resources come, I do think they also should be used to support innovation. And this links to some of the ideas that we heard about from Dana and Derek. I mean, obviously, Dana's piece focuses on the New York City efforts led by Mayor Bloomberg, and they're trying to actually experiment and assess innovation. And often they're doing it in ways that try to leverage recent insights from the field of behavioral economics and asset building. And I think that this is both promising, but really it's this embrace of experimentation and assessment that is really what's so powerful about their approach. So they're trying something new, but then they're also trying to figure out if it works or not. And there's really an array of policies that they're looking at this way. So Dana mentioned one effort, but there's another one that I'm familiar with. I work with where they're intervening at free tax site preparation sites for low-income people. And when people are getting their tax return, they're providing a direct match for money that's deposited into special savings accounts called Save NYC. And they've piloted this for 2 years. They're on a third year. And they're actually learning about a lot of the dynamics because they're studying what families do, and they've already generated some interest, participation, and real savings. And this kind of effort is important in its own right, but it's informing a federal policy idea that's being put forth by Senator Menendez of New Jersey and Representative Blumenauer from Oregon, called the Savers Bonus, which is at tax time providing an accessible incentive for eligible families if they devote money to saving. So it's very promising. Now, Derek's contributions are valuable in a number of respects. Obviously he's recognizing, not just the racial dimension of poverty, but how this has played out over time. And he's signifying, he's highlighting the significance of the wealth gap, which potentially is more enduring and of greater significance than the income inequality. And in response, he suggests this intervention that focuses on children and endowing them with resources at 18 of $50,000. And he writes and mentioned about several other initiatives that I've been a part of that focus on promoting universal savings accounts at birth, the Aspire Act, and this is something that endows everyone with a $500 endowment. So it's an alternative approach. I think we can find a happy medium somewhere. But what I want to emphasize there is that one of the promising aspects of an Aspire Act approach is that it plays out across the life course and potentially gets some of the intervention by giving children access and familiarity with resources, with an account and a framework, and getting them to think and orient toward their future. And I think it's a potentially promising approach. In general, when we've been trying to promote savings and wealth building ideas, really the critique of the current paradigm is that it provides middle and upper income families with access to tax breaks and advantages to promote this, but really leaves lower income people with fewer and less attractive ways to save and build wealth. And this is a kind of paradigm that I think does need to shift in the future to create a more inclusive framework and create some space for some of these innovative ideas that we've heard from today and that are covered in other aspects of articles in the special report. So those are some just initial comments. I'll turn it back over to Mark for an extended discussion.
Not by me. Thank you, Reed, and thank you, Shelley, and Derek, and Dana. I really want to emphasize. I think this gives a really good sampling of some of the ideas in the special report. There's a lot of other aspects to the report for example, Alan Jenkins' article about how some of the things that were in the stimulus package really create some openings to really think about equality of opportunity. And also want to emphasize that, at the American Prospect, we don't just, do the report and then we're done with the issue. We really are covering these kinds of questions day in and day out, both in the magazine and our website, prospect.org. Dana's been writing about a lot of the issues around the health care bill, for example, and how they affect women and low-income families. So I really recommend you don't just read the special report. We got a lot going on here. Let me just open it up for questions, with the ground rules being state your name and institutional affiliation if it's relevant, and try to put it in a form that reasonably would have a question mark at the end of it without adding the phrase, don't you agree, for example. And, you can address a question to everybody or anybody or whatever subset of the people up here you want to address. Yes, right behind, yes.
My name's Nancy Waugh. I'm with the Pension Rights Center. My question has to do with retirement.
Oh, sorry, and wait for the microphone.
Okay.
I guess that's the other
My
rule.
name's Nancy Waugh, and I'm with the Pension Rights Center, though my question has really nothing to do with retirement security. My question's for Ms. Goldstein. With regarding the New York City program, was there a philosophical or practical reason why there were no prescriptive restrictions on how they could spend their CCTs?
Well, the Mexican program that this is based off of was similar in that way. I mean, with micropayments, you're giving women money, say, to start a business, and it's prescriptive, but CCTs don't work that way. Just that's the ideology of them. And I also think that, from an American perspective, there's something a little bit strange. I think it would rub a lot of us the wrong way to say, not only are we going to try to influence your parenting behavior by paying you money for what we consider, good middle-class parenting, but then we're also going to tell you what to do with the money afterwards. So the researchers are certainly interested in sort of asking in the interview follow-up sessions how the money got spent, but it's, whether people are going to be 100% truthful about that or whether, I don't know necessarily how I spent my salary last week versus $500 I made for some freelance work that I did on the side at night. So I don't know how effective it's really going to be to try to follow up on how the money does get spent over time.
Freelance work, I'm shocked to hear about this. Yeah. Yes.
I'm Alan Gold from Results. My question is, did we go overboard on the idea of home ownership as the main way for people to accumulate assets, and then that led to the debacle of the funny loans? Anybody? Yes.
Well, I think people started to use the new products to be exploitative. I guess you've heard the term redlining. A lot of people are referring to the new paradigm as reverse redlining, where certain neighborhoods were targeted for predatory lending and those type of aspects. So I think the profit incentive created incentives where firms started to become predatory. There were some benefits from these products that were created in the 1990s. We had increases in home ownership rates. During the Bush administration, we had home ownership disparities were at their lowest. And we know that home ownership has been a vehicle of wealth accumulation in this country for a long time. It created a middle class. The problem is, without proper regulation and oversight, these products led to predatory predation on certain vulnerable populations.
Yeah, I'd certainly feel comfortable associating myself with that answer. I think that there are been some successes and also some failures, and the failures certainly seem to fall a lot on the way that the financing system was regulated and not regulated, and not in terms of how people were striving to become homeowners, because that is something that there were a great number of successes as well. The current challenge right now is that really at a neighborhood dimension. There are a lot of these communities that are really afflicted. So even when people acted in the right way or responsibly, that their home values are down as well from kind of these kind of neighborhood effects, and that's, I think, something to really watch out for in the future. And we're going to need some other resources available to stabilize neighborhoods, in addition to the work of making sure people get to stay in their homes, regardless of what their past conduct was. But just as a word, kind of as a social policy, we're going to need to avoid mass displacement that people are really being pressured into right now.
And I'll just chime in with a commercial as a good consulting editor. Manuel Pastor has an excellent article, and if we could have afforded to fly him here from California, about this place-based issue. And it's in this collection of articles, and I'd point you to it because I think this issue of place-based is sort of, it's on the agenda. The Obama administration has clearly taken a perspective of place-based with both choice neighborhoods and promise neighborhoods and an urban czar to really sort of think about this in a place perspective, and I think it's something we should all wrap our heads around.
And I'll just add that I think it's been interesting to watch as the assets community kind of develops a recognition that, while obviously you want people to have a foundation of assets, whether it's a home or other savings, there are conditions under which, even absent reverse redlining or funny financial instruments, you can make people more vulnerable. So that I think it brings us back to a recognition that making sure people have the security they need, especially without a ton of wealth, especially without a ton of income, that security is as important as assets. And I always think there's sort of a byplay. There's sort of a setup of choice between opportunity programs and things that help you just charge ahead into the economy, and security things get treated as old-fashioned. That's things like unemployment insurance. That's the old New Deal, and I think especially we saw this in the fight over Social Security privatization. These things that help you move ahead are the new thing. Security is the old thing. Well, security is a really important foundation for anybody to be able to move forward, and some things achieve that, and there are certain circumstances that don't. There are certain circumstances where you are actually more vulnerable being a homeowner than not being a homeowner, and that's true in any situation where home prices are not always going to increase. And there's no reason to expect poor people to be smarter than Bear Stearns about this, but that was the delusion. Yeah, let me get some folks in the back. Debbie.
Thanks, Mark. Debbie Weinstein, Coalition on Human Needs. First, thank you very much for both the special issue and this very interesting presentation. It's a struggle because you want to be able to finish the sentence, the solution to poverty is this, and that would be a pretty long sentence, and so I guess one thing that wasn't mentioned as much in the panel, and I'd invite you to comment on, is jobs. And some groups that we're trying to follow the lead of have asked for language establishing some form of preference for low-income people, say whether it's in climate change, so some of the renewable energy jobs. I would like to see it in healthcare jobs or any sector where there might be some possibility of increased jobs. While recognizing, again, this is not the full answer to the solution to poverty is, what would be your reaction to any additional emphasis in your agenda to this area?
I'm happy to start. I think, Debbie, I think you're right that we think that jobs actually are the solution to poverty, but we think that there are a lot of supports to make jobs pay. So I think we concentrated on the supports piece, especially in a time of a downturned economy when there aren't jobs, and how do you get people into the next wave. So I think that piece, there were so many pieces. I remember one meeting with Mark where we were trying to narrow the list of articles and we kept adding. But I think jobs, wages, unionization, there's a whole host of things that will make work pay. And then there's the pipeline issue, is how do you get the folks that are not into the pipeline into those those industries. And right now it's particularly hard because you're standing in line behind folks who are more skilled but out of work. You're standing in line behind, behind union folks who are first off but first back on when the construction industry, for example, turns around. So I think it's a key piece, and how we haven't figured out, I don't think yet, how we get the low wage, low skilled workers into that first rung and then what Harry Holzer calls the middle skill jobs. How do we help them move up that ladder? And that's where I think our TANF and WIA debates, if we could actually bring those conversations together in some way, are incredibly important. And right now, so not on the radar. I mean, you talk to people who should be doing TANF on the Hill, and they talk to you about healthcare, which I don't want to take them off healthcare. That's a critical piece. Another one that Mark and I, we didn't cover in this piece, but it's crucial. But if we were being really smart and proactive about this, we would be thinking about the interplay of TANF and WIA with all of the stimulus dollars, and how do we actually create those linkages for low-wage workers. I think it's key. It's a great point.
One thing with regards to the stimulus package that I think we should hold the administration accountable to, and that is the racial and ethnic distribution of jobs created by the stimulus package. For example, the construction industry. We like to talk about skills, but those, I wouldn't call them low-skilled jobs because I couldn't do it. But they require probably an 11th grade education up to some college in terms of formal education. And we know that industry in particular has historically and currently not had a great number of African-American workers in there. So we have this surge of stimulus in that occupation. Let's see if those jobs get distributed in a race-fair manner.
And a gender-fair manner. Because we know that extra funding for education and health jobs to prevent layoffs, we know that women disproportionately benefit from that. But the issue, like the sort of women that I was talking about with Mayor Bloomberg's program, low skill or almost like women with no education and low skills, they're not being benefited by job creation in the construction sector. So we need to think about, to the extent that jobs are the solution, what is the solution for that kind of person, the pink collar person?
And I'll say, in defense of our decision not to include an article about jobs, that's kind of like the American Prospect doesn't lack for articles about jobs. And we actually have a special report on decent work and some of the ways to enforce that in our upcoming issue. We tend to have a lot on labor policy. I will say, talking about one issue that I think folks should be thinking about with regard to healthcare, and I never see healthcare folks thinking about this, is the degree to which when people want to reduce excess spending in healthcare, how much of the excess spending that we're going to reduce is actually the kind of spending that's one of the few things that is actually creating career ladder jobs in poor communities. I mean, it's really something. A lot of cities without a lot of manufacturing base or anything else have that hospital. They have those nursing homes. That's one of the things that creates really good opportunities for people to move to mid-level jobs. So as we're kind of trying to squeeze costs out of the system, it's quite possible, I think, that one person's excess spending becomes another person's entry-level great opportunity, nursing care job, things like that. I saw a hand up way in the back. The lights are blaring. Yes, all the way in the back, and then I'll get you.
I'm Roxana Barias with the Conference of Catholic Bishops, and I have two questions. One, I'm a little bit interested in the 3% of the women in the CCT program. If you found any characteristics about these women, I'm just wondering if they're immigrant women, for example. And then the other question is regarding food stamps, SNAP benefits. I just find it very interesting that people, because it is a federal program that works well, where there's little fraud, people sort of assume we're doing well there. And I'm wondering what happens with the 40% and plus folks who are eligible who are not getting SNAP benefits, who could, and whether there are issues there that we need to be looking at.
Yes, there's some anecdotal evidence that among the more successful women at taking advantage of the work benefits are the immigrant women. For example, one of the stories I heard was about a widowed woman who had 12 kids who had managed to enroll herself in nursing school. through the program, through some of the money that she was getting through the program. And then because she was able to do that, she got even more income from the program. So there's some anecdotal evidence of that, but we're going to have to wait for more hard-edged data there.
Yeah, and I'll talk about the SNAP program. So absolutely, and I kind of gave it a quick brush off in the comments, but there are certainly lots of things we could be doing. If you look at generally participation rates, though, across both most of the means-tested programs, both entitlements and non-entitlements, believe it or not, SNAP is doing pretty well. I think EITC tends to do better, so that tells us something about using a tax system. But compared to some of the other ones, which are frankly abysmal, so child care being somewhere down around 19%, housing vouchers under 10%, it is one of the better ones. Now, why is it better? The feds have invested in outreach, and it's a purely federal entitlement program. So right now, for example, the states aren't disincentivizing food stamp take-up rates because it's not coming out of their pockets for the most part. It's coming out of the federal reserves. And the requirements to get on the program don't have, compared to some of our other programs, a big work focus. So I think it's based on need, but not necessarily any sort of action of past performance around work. So I think we can see some signals of things to learn from, but certainly lots to do there. We could definitely be increasing outreach and participation. I think we can better align it with other programs such as unemployment insurance. And again, I think thinking about creative ways to make it less burdensome on the recipient to get the benefits that they deserve, and figuring out ways to help sort of no wrong door, speeding express lane access to get folks the benefits that they need. And it is true, though, even as a federal program, I was reading a story, I think, about Utah, who's gone down to a 4-day work week in their states because the states run out of money, that food stamp applications are piling up in state offices. So we've still, even though this is supposed to be one of our better counter-cyclical programs, we've still got some problems in trying to get the money out the door.
Great, thanks. And question by the pillar over there, yes.
Hello, Catherine Hildum, and I represent the First 5 Years Fund. And my question has to do with probably something that was on the list of priorities that Shelley just mentioned, is what role do you all see child care and early childhood education playing in this whole area of alleviating poverty? We know not only for a job, for allowing people to go to work, but also the return on investment in early childhood, quality early childhood programs. It lowers incidence of dependence on social service programs, as well as increasing productivity and wages later in life. Could you comment a little bit on the role that those investments play?
I can't overstate how important I think child care is. I mean, when you're looking at the kind of people that I was writing about, it's single moms. Without child care, the entire spectrum of opportunity open for them is just severely, severely constricted. But I think really Sarah Mead, who's an expert here at the New America Foundation on early childhood, is probably the person whose stuff you want to read and who you want to talk to about early childhood stuff. She's wonderful, and you can find a lot of her work on New America's site.
And I'll comment a little, since I know a little something about early childhood. So it was one that I think we wanted to write about, but didn't get to. But it's a critical piece, both as a work support and as a generational poverty reduction measure. I mean, I think the research is pretty conclusive that it mitigates a lot of the negative impacts if we do early childhood well. And also, people cannot show up at a job if you don't have somewhere to take your children. So to me, it's a no-brainer. I think it could be a whole other edition, I think, on the politics of why childcare hasn't moved forward. And I think, in general, it's a lot of our nation's ambiguity about whether or not we really want women working anyway. But I think one of the things that jumped out at me in this context of sort of the downturn is that we really... So you've lost your job, you're a working mom. The child care piece is so now closely tied to TANF, and states have so calibrated child care subsidies to TANF. in some states, not only if you lose your job, but if you get your hours cut, you lose the equivalent number of hours of your child care. So I'm a mom, I'm working 30 hours a week, I have 30 hours of child care, I've now just been cut to 20 hours a week. So now I have 20 hours a week of child care. Well, what's that doing to my child care situation is a whole other story. But how do I go and try to find another job to get back up to full-time work? We don't provide the same level of child care subsidies for people who are going through education and training programs as we do work. Again, our work-first cobwebs here. And we know that's both bad for the mom who's trying to make it to full-time work. We also know that's terribly bad for the child because it creates instability for the caregiving situation and a lot of times. And it doesn't really work for the child care providers who aren't incentivized to take low-wage subsidies from low-wage workers because of the rules and regulations. So I think there's a lot. To me, it is a no-brainer, and it's so incredibly important, as Dana says, when you look at the lives of families. But we got to get there on the policy and the politics. So maybe Mark can help us with that.
I just added a magazine. Yes.
This is a question for anyone.
Why don't you wait for the microphone? So, no, wait for the microphone, and then go, and then.
This is open to anyone who wants to answer. And I just was taking notes as you all were talking. If you could address, because I want to just follow up specifically on Mr. Hamilton, because you went into a little bit of history. And I think as someone's lived in 6 countries outside of my own, U.S., is too often the discussion is more about confusing symptoms and problems. And I'm kind of hearing this here in some comments and thoughts. But I'm going to throw these points out and then please respond. To achieve some of these goals that you are considering and addressing, the impact of, and this kind of follows up with what you just had mentioned, the obsession with commerce as the end-all of American society. I think we tend to get into a vacuum here that the rest of the world is functioning, that this is the beginning, end of life, the alpha and omega. These overlap a bit. To the American naivete, dangerous naivete of its understanding of the human condition. And the American dream, I believe, plays that out. If, in other words, and we hear this in the health forum, town hall meetings, discussion about the health forum, if government's off my back, the neighbors leave me alone, I have all the opportunity in the world to make all the money for me and grab more. Back to the good mayor of New York. 3, the absence of an evolutionary tribal culture. The absence of the collective. 4, insularism.
Maybe we should leave it at that because we're really running out of time, and
but
people are getting a little
antsy. We feel that we
antsy.
have to reinvent the wheel. That, for example, dealing with lower wages, or always thinking about only going off to college as the end-all, where in Germany we don't have to reinvent this. They have a superb program of bringing the private sector, government sector, and communities to train, skillfully train those who are not interested in being university educated. And then lastly, the inheritance of the British Empire Elizabethan poor laws.
Okay.
And who's worthy of help.
Okay. Does anybody want to comment on any of those points, each of which could be an essay unto itself? And perhaps should be, and maybe has, yeah.
Well, I think the number one reason poor people are poor is because they're poor. They lack resources. I'm trying to be somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but it's in the context of American society, I think, is becoming more aligned with the discourse that it's behavioral. And the solutions that we have put in place in the past 20 years or so have become more and more behavioral, addressing behavior. Things like the Welfare Reform Act. And I don't think it's so removed from the discourse on racial inequality as well, largely because our image of poor people are these people that are black, Latino, something other. And in response, we come up with policies, and I think the conditional cash transfers are aligned with this rubric of policies that address behaviors. The original Mexican policy was really designed as income replacement or income substitution so that families could allow their children to go to school rather than work on the farm so that they can generate revenue. Well, in the U.S., we have a different context. If the issue is resource, then perhaps we should have programs designed to facilitate resources, not necessarily address behaviors. And the problem I have with all of this is that it's not really based on sound empirical evidence. I haven't seen a lot of the empirical evidence to suggest that these individuals or these groups are engaged in behaviors that are detrimental to their success. We can find anecdotes. With any population, you'll find individuals in that population that are behaviorally not doing according to what they should be doing. So just to sum it up, I think we have to be careful with these experiments without having some grounded textual evidence to support these experiments we perform on individuals, because if you do enough experiments, you will eventually find the results that you anticipate finding. But we should consider the fact that poor people are poor simply because they are poor and lack resources.
The point that you brought up about vocational education and alternatives to college, I think is really important. At the risk of opening up a can of worms, the Obama administration and most education reform efforts right now are focused on sort of a college readiness curriculum for everyone. And there's very legitimate questions, especially when you're thinking about poverty alleviation, about whether that's practical, whether that is a realistic view of human nature, and especially considering the deficits that so many kids bring into the school system. So I'm a fan of exploring vocational education possibilities for that reason, so that we can prepare people realistically for the job market that they're going into. I think community colleges have a really big role to play, and generally reform of our community college system and bringing standards and accountability to that system is important, as important as K through 12 reform.
Thanks. All right. Anybody have a super fast, like maximum 10-word question?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
You've mentioned workforce development. Sorry, Cecilio Morales from Employment and Training Reporter. You've mentioned welfare reform and workforce development. Do you have anything specific that you would say? I mean, WIA is up in 2010, TANF is up in 2011, so they're not going to happen at the right time anyway. Do you have anything specific that they should address to get them connected?
Well, one is the obvious, which is resources. I mean, I think we need to be putting more resources into the program. But I think, from what I understand, and again, my colleague Karen Martinson, I'd refer you to, who's really the expert in this field. But from what I understand, they've been most successful when they have been connected to employers and to both regional and local economic situations that really connect folks to jobs that are really going to be there. So whether it's health or health IT or green jobs, that we really have a much more integrated system similar to what they have in Germany that really connects the public sector with the private sector, with low-wage workers, and a system that really meets their needs. And I think we have to get very real, again, and not to take it all back to sort of the childcare discussion, but I think we have to get very real too about what it takes to get people through some of these training programs, and that just covering tuition doesn't work. That we have to really wrapping around the support systems to get folks into the systems and into the jobs. So I think there's a really it's ripe for a robust conversation about how we do that, what's worked and what hasn't. And I think TANF should be a part of that conversation, in as much as right now, getting people into a job is hard enough. States are, just getting their penalties for not meeting work requirements. I think we will probably see that again, given the economy. So I think now's a really good time to be engaging in that conversation about how we help those folks. And in as much as it's difficult to get through these programs, these training programs, we have to really figure out how we layer on the support systems that families need. So that's where I'd start, but call Karen too.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I want to, on behalf of the Prospect, I want to thank Reed for taking the initiative to pull this panel together, and then and Shelley for all her help with the issue, and her and Derek and Dana for their contributions, as well as the people who aren't here. And I really appreciate all of you coming and your sharp questions, and and being part of this. So thank you. Do you want to close off? Lee?
No, thank you.